The Gospel of Luke was written during the 1st century to a man named Theophilus to help him be certain of the things he had been taught concerning Jesus Christ and the events surrounding his death and resurrection. How does this impact our belief today? What can we learn through this special book in order that we too may be certain? Today, author and musician Michael Card looks at the final days of Jesus' life on earth on this day of discovery.
It's a long journey through the wilderness. We began in Rome to try to lay the foundation for our imaginations to interact with the book of Luke. And we went to Galilee and saw the beginning of the ministry, tried to understand the flow, how the ministry of Jesus began. And we took that long journey that began in Galilee, up the Jordan Valley, up through this wilderness to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is just on the other side of the hill from where we are now. All along, we've been trying to listen to the detail of Scripture and asking ourselves better questions. What does this mean? And along the way, back to Jerusalem, there was a wonderful story that Jesus told, a parable about His second coming, what it would be like. He's stressing the fact that we need to be ready for that coming by serving until He comes. And you have to read closely, but you'll see in chapter 12, there's a single verse where Jesus says that for those who were waiting for the Master when He comes back, He says the Master will get up from the table, dress Himself to serve, and wait on them.
Blessed are those servants whom the Master, when He comes, will find watching. Assuredly I say to you that He will gird Himself and have them sit down to eat, and will come and serve them. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 12.
You've got to think about it for just a second. Does that sound familiar at all? The Master getting up from the table, dressing Himself to serve, and waiting on them. That's Jesus and John when He washed His disciples' feet. But Luke wants us to know that Jesus has in mind that same event, Jesus who's the same yesterday, today, and forever. That same thing's going to happen at the glorious celebration that we believe we're all headed to, the wedding supper of the Lamb. Jesus is going to get up from the table, according to Luke. He's going to dress Himself to serve, and He's going to wait on us.
Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into His hands, and that He had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside His garments, took a towel and girded Himself. After that He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which He was girded. The Gospel of John, chapter 13.
This is the rooftop of an old Crusader building that's supposedly the spot where the upper room happened, where Jesus had the final meal with His disciples. But we're right in the middle of the old part of Jerusalem. There's construction going all around. There's hammering over here. They're putting a new roof on over here, so you may hear the tin. It's a busy place. Behind me is the King David Hotel. In front of me is the Mount of Olives. I can just barely see the dome, the gold dome of the Dome of the Rock. At this point in the story, it's Passover's come. And Jesus sends Peter and John to make the elaborate preparations for the meal, the relishes and the bread and the wine and the lamb. And He tells them that they'll know the spot when they see a man carrying a water jar. Now that's a unique thing because men don't carry water, so that's a good sign for them to find the place where the meal is going to be celebrated. They all settle in around the triclinium, around the three-sided table, and the meal progresses. At the end of the meal, as the shadows are gathering around them, the disciples are sort of stunned. Jesus has spoken of His body being broken, of His blood being poured out, and they're sort of in a daze. And then Jesus says something that makes it even worse. He makes the prediction that one of them is going to betray Him. And they begin to argue which one it might be, and then that argument transitions into an argument about who's the greatest, Luke tells us. And it was in response to that argument that Jesus did what he does in John. Only John tells us that he gets up from the table and he washes their feet. Now that is clearly him dealing with this argument about who's the greatest. It's a living parable. He becomes a servant. He becomes their slave. But only Luke tells us what happens after the washing of the disciples' feet. Jesus settles back into his place and he says, don't be like the Gentiles. He's appealing to their identity as Jewish men. The Gentiles just do things so that they can be called benefactors. You're not supposed to be like that. And see if this doesn't sound like a person who's just washed their feet. Jesus says, who's greater, the one at the table or the one who serves? He said, but I'm among you as one who serves.
Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 22.
We're at a high point in the Mount of Olives, above the traffic and the noise, the busy city. You can hear prayers over the loudspeaker. You can hear a tractor working the garden farther down. It's hard to imagine what the 11 must have felt as they left the upper room, came across the valley behind me, and entered the shadows, the safety of the trees of the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke tells us that Jesus left the disciples at the entrance to the garden and told them to pray so that they wouldn't fall into temptation. He was worried about them. John tells us that he takes the three farther in to the garden with him. And Luke has a very brief sketch of Gethsemane, but he gives us a detail that none of the other Gospels give us. He tells us an angel came to comfort Jesus. This isn't the first time that angels had come in Mark 1 when he's in the temptation in the wilderness. Mark tells us that angels came and ministered to him. It was an unsuccessful mission for this angel because Luke tells us after the angel had come that Jesus' grief was intensified, that his sweat actually became blood. He is alone. In fact, from this point on, even though he's going to be surrounded by a mob, it's as if he's alone for the rest of the story of the Passion. And it's not until the resurrection, when he's once again together with the disciples that he loves, it seems like he's no longer alone and he's fully himself once more.
And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. When he rose up from prayer and had come to his disciples, he found them sleeping from sorrow. Then he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation." And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders who had come to him, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 22.
This is the Church of Peter and Gallicantu, the traditional site where Caiaphas' courtyard was located. But more important to me, behind me are a set of steps that many scholars believe are reliably an area where Jesus would have actually walked when he was coming and going from the Mount of Olives to the upper room, and then when he was brought back here to this place and to be questioned by Caiaphas. Now, initially he was taken to the courtyard of Annas, who was the high priest, and he was held there while the Sanhedrin could be called for a late night illegal meeting. They were not supposed to meet at night. And it was in this courtyard that something happened that only Luke tells us about. Now, the other Gospels tell us about Peter's denials, but only Luke tells us that upon his third denial, Peter turned and discovered that Jesus was looking straight at him. And that word for look at is the Greek word emblepo, and it's the only time it occurs in the Gospel of Luke. It's once in the first chapter of John, the very first time they lay eyes on each other, Jesus looks at Peter this way. And then it happens here in Luke 22 at the end of the story. So this one very specific word is used to describe in two different situations the way Jesus looks at Peter. Now, emblepo means to see with your mind, to look at knowingly. I usually translate it gaze. So what happens upon the third denial is that Peter turns and he sees that Jesus is looking intently at him with his mind. And it's that look that breaks Peter. I like to imagine what the content of that look was. I'm certain it wasn't a condemning look like Peter said, I told you you would deny me, so you're a dirty, rotten scoundrel. I don't think that would have broken Peter. I think the look, the emblepo look, was a look of compassion and a look of forgiveness. He'd already forgiven Peter for what he was going to do. But Luke tells us at that point, Peter left this courtyard and went out and wept bitterly.
And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, This man was also with him. But he denied him, saying, Woman, I do not know him. And after a little while another saw him and said, You also are of them. But Peter said, Man, I am not. Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you are saying. Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 22.
We're on the western side of the old city of Jerusalem, just down from the Jaffa Gate, the area where Jesus would have been sent to Pilate. Pilate was staying in Herod's palace that was there. Now Luke focuses more than any other gospel on the innocence of Jesus. Because Luke had been a companion of Paul, we believe that the gospel was written as a cover document for a collection of Paul's letters that would have been used in his trial. So you can understand why Luke would emphasize that Jesus was innocent, because it's Paul's innocence that they're eventually going to be talking about. You have to understand that the Jews had to get Jesus to Pilate as early in the morning as they possibly could, because Pilate has a whole day of organized leisure in front of him. He's going to go to the bath, he's going to go to the gymnasium, and he gets his business done very early in the morning. So Jesus is brought, and he's investigated by Pilate, who doesn't want to have anything to do with it. He wants to be rid of Jesus. This is just a troublesome blip in his day. He finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, and he decides he's going to send Jesus to Herod Antipas, because Herod was ruler of that province. We find all kinds of interesting details about Herod that we don't know from any other gospel. We know that Herod had been longing to see Jesus, and he wanted to see him do a miracle. Only Luke knows that. How is that? Remember back in chapter 8, one of the women that's traveling with Jesus and his disciples? Her name is Joanna. She's the wife of Chuza, who is the head of Herod's household. So that has to be Luke's source. He knows things about Herod that no one else knows. Herod wants to see Jesus do a miracle, and Jesus will have nothing to do with it. He won't even answer his questions. So Herod and his soldiers make fun of Jesus. They dress him up in an elegant robe. Apparently they find nothing worth charging him with, and they send him back to Pilate. And once again, Pilate, before the Jewish leadership, is maintaining again and again and again the innocence of Jesus. That's Luke's perspective on the story. Pilate even offers to illegally have Jesus flogged just to satisfy them and then let him go. He has nothing to do with this innocent man, he says. But eventually he gives in to the crowd and he hands Jesus over to be crucified. And even one of the thieves on either side of Jesus is going to say that he was innocent.
Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them. But they shouted, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Then he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go." But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. But he delivered Jesus to their will. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 23.
At this point in the story, Jesus is led out to be crucified. He's carrying the crossbeam on his shoulders. He's weak from being flogged. Some people didn't survive the floggings. That killed some people. So he stumbles at one point, and the Roman soldiers take a man from the crowd. His name's Simon. By law, a Roman soldier could make a citizen carry a burden for a mile. In Matthew 5, Jesus told his disciples, when that happens to you, you should carry it 2 miles. So Simon helps Jesus carry his burden on the way to the cross. That's a mixed crowd that's following along. There are people that are mocking, and there are people who are weeping, women who are weeping. And Jesus will stop at one point, and it's the last long pronouncement we have of Jesus. And he'll predict once again the destruction of Jerusalem, and he'll warn these women. Now from this point on, all we hear from Jesus will be short, gasping phrases because he's on the cross. Now once he's on the cross, Luke tells us that he's crucified between 2 thieves. And one of those thieves sees Jesus as innocent. There again is this pronouncement of the innocence of Jesus. Now this thief, we don't know his name. He has absolutely nothing to gain by standing up for Jesus against the other crucified man who's mocking him. He just sees 2 things. He sees his own guilt, and he sees Jesus. And that seeing made all the difference for him.
Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." The Gospel of Luke, chapter 23.
Of all the places to go in Jerusalem, this is my favorite place. No crowds, no tickets, no lines. We're in the back of a park, a secluded park behind the King David Hotel. If you ever come to Jerusalem, I encourage you to try to find this place. This is a 1st century Herodian tomb, like the tomb Jesus would have been in for just a little while. You see the large circular stone that has to be rolled into place. You see the steps going down. In the Gospels, we read of Peter having to stoop down and look inside the tomb. So you can come here, spend as much time as you want, and really understand and engage with your imagination what that Easter morning was like. But if you're going to understand Easter morning, there's one thing you have to make perfectly clear, and that is the disciples and the women had zero expectations, no expectations that he would be raised from the dead, even though Jesus had told them more than once. The women come to the tomb to anoint a dead body. They have spices to anoint the body. When they see that the stone has been rolled away, they think someone has stolen the body. Later, the disciples will come. The women will run to tell Peter and the 12, or the 11, that Jesus is raised from the dead. And Luke will tell us, he uses a medical term, that the women were delirious. Just a bunch of delirious women. But Peter and John will run to the tomb to see for themselves. Luke tells us that Peter looks into the tomb, sees the burial clothes, and so much like Luke, he walks away amazed. Luke, the Gospel of Amazement. Later on, there were two disciples walking to Emmaus, and only Luke tells us this story. They're walking along, talking about all the things that have taken place in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden, Jesus is with them. He's walking along beside them. He says, what are you talking about as you walk along? And they say, are you the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all these things that have happened about Jesus the Nazarene? And then they make one phrase. They say one phrase that really encapsulates their feelings. They said, we had hoped. Their hope is gone. You have to understand that if you're a disciple of Jesus, everything is over. It's all been for nothing. That's the turnaround that happens on Easter morning. And Jesus says, how foolish, how slow of heart. And then he gives them the best Bible lesson that was ever given. He explains everything in the Old Testament concerning himself. And if I have a problem with Luke didn't give me a single word of that lesson. I would have loved to have heard that. Jesus acts as if he's going on once they get to the house where they're staying, and they ask him to come in. It's almost Shakespearean. They say, the day is almost over, so you come and stay with us. So they sit down at the table, and Jesus breaks the bread. And when that happens, Luke tells us their eyes were opened. Whatever it was covering their eyes is taken away. And as soon as they recognize it's Jesus, he vanishes. Zero expectations when they come to the meal. And yet, they recognize the presence of Jesus. That happens 1,000 times all over the world every day when we share the cup and the bread and recognize that he is there for us. And it's a challenge and a question every time I take the cup to ask myself, what are my expectations? Well, we're back in Rome where our journey began. We began here and looked at the history. We did our homework, and we tried to start our imaginations in the process. Next, we went to Galilee, that beautiful self-contained world where Jesus' ministry began, where the disciples were called and trained. Luke was with us all along. Luke, with his first-rate mind and his heart so engaged. Then we went to Jerusalem for the end of the journey, that long final journey to Jerusalem, that journey that so captured Luke's imagination. And finally, there was that darkest of all moments, that moment when even the sun refused to shine, and then there was the light that came from that moment, a light that we're still enjoying. It's been a long journey, but we still have a long way to go. I hope this won't be the end of the journey for you. I hope that your imagination has been captured by what resonated with Luke and what still resonates in his special book.
Now it came to pass, while he blessed them, that he was parted from them and carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple, praising and blessing God. Amen. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 24.